our talk in the Carnegie Lecture Series tonight. It's anniversary of the Constitutional Convention of the United States of America, and Dr. Tom Jones is Taylor's expert on American history for that time period, and he's going to give us a talk tell us about the Constitutional Convention and the history of how it came together in 1787. Tom Jones.
Well, thank you, Colin. Colin is one of my students in years past. I want to thank you for coming this afternoon. Mary, good to see you. I've worked with Marion on some projects here at the library, and always enjoyed that. And Tim, good to see you in the audience as well. And my friends from Taylor. Now, you may see them holding cards up at the end of the presentation. We'll toss out the high score and the low score, and that'll be the average. Hopefully no one thinking they're the French judge, the Russian judge in this. The purpose of the presentation tonight is for us to get to remind ourselves of how the Constitution came into being, to think a little bit like those who were there in Philadelphia in that summer of 1787, and to think a little bit about how they were thinking, and a little bit about the why of what they produced. How many of you have been to the General Assembly in Indiana? Anybody? Did you ever see a General Assembly room look that organized and that neat? And I can assure you in the summer of 1787, Independence Hall did not look that neat, that organized, and it certainly wasn't air conditioned. But fortunately for the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, it was a cooler summer in 1787 than had been the case in previous summers, contrary to what we normally think of. Nonetheless, being in this room with windows closed, because this was supposed to be a closed discussion. No one was supposed to know what they were deliberating during this time, so windows closed. And you know the kind of heavy clothing they wore. So not only would it not have looked that neat, I wouldn't have wanted to smell the odor that was in that room as well. It really was a miracle, though, that the 55 delegates whittled down to about 39 who signed the actual document, that they were able to come up with what they produced. Rhode Island did not attend. Yeah, I see some of you are getting out your reading glasses. If you've not been to the optometrist recently, you may want to move closer to it. They began with 55 delegates, and all of the 13 states, with the exception of Rhode Island, present. Many of those who came had the idea that, well, what they were going to do was tweak the Articles of Confederation. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what they felt needed to be tweaked. But there were those who came to the convention in Philadelphia that summer, absolutely committed to coming up with something new, something different, something that would ensure that what they had established at the end of the Revolution could be sustained. Because there were many people, including George Washington, and many of those around Washington, who had come to the conclusion that they were at a critical time. And it was quite possible that all that they had won in the Revolution was going to be lost at this moment in time. Not entirely unlike how many people, or some people at least, think of things these days. The debates were closed. Supposedly everyone keeping things secret. Try to imagine 535 folks in Washington today in meetings that are supposed to be closed, keeping it secret. And if the Supreme Court can't prevent leaks, what are the odds that we'd be able to come up with something like that today. In fact, my brother was a White House correspondent for CBS News and covered the Ford administration, and then was reassigned to Capitol Hill, and loved that because there were always leaks on Capitol Hill. There were always stories to be had. This group did a pretty good job, though, of keeping their conversations limited to what they were talking about in the Independence Hall. From the very beginning, though, there were those who showed up, like Patrick Henry, who picked up that this was not just a tweaking of the articles. This was a major shift. And what Washington and Madison and others were hoping for would be a government that had a government with strong central powers, a strong federal system of government. So Henry's famous line was, "I smell a rat." And Henry and some other delegates left. Their challenge was to provide order, at the same time to preserve the freedom that all had come to enjoy at the state level. Now, there were some successes under the Articles of Confederation. I want to call attention to a couple. The Land Ordinance of 1785, I think, is very important in regard to how these delegates are thinking. The second bullet there, the Land Ordinance of 1785 stated that as the townships were being divided and sectioned off as they were being surveyed, Section 16 in every township was to be set aside to promote education. And the idea was it would be a free public education. And the idea being that in order to sustain the freedom that we won in the Revolution, it was essential that we have an educated electorate. Now, we're not talking about Harvard, Phi Beta Kappas, but we're talking about individuals who could read and write, were literate, could read the newspapers, individuals who could function in the kind of leadership positions in the community that are necessary to sustain the kind of system that we have. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, I want to call attention to the very last listings there, the fundamental rights. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 ensured freedom of religion, the right to trial by a jury, the right to a writ of habeas corpus, and stated unequivocally that slavery would be prohibited in the states that would emerge from this territory. That, of course, is going to be a matter of great debate later. And the Dred Scott decision is going to hinge on this idea that even before the Constitution, there was this understanding that slavery would not extend into this territory. So think about that in regard to the kinds of topics that are going to be discussed as this Constitution is being put together. Okay, that's not good. At the end of the enterprise, well, let's try this again. How many of you had to memorize this? The preamble of the Constitution. How many of you have grandchildren who have come to visit you and they've recited the preamble of the Constitution? Yeah, it's there are very few places where the preamble is recited or committed to memory. And yet, this is a statement of what they were trying to do, imperfectly, but what they were trying to accomplish during the convention that begins in May. May the 26th is a Saturday in 1787. Guys like Washington and several others have traveled by coach and by horse, and they've walked and so on. They're there a bit early, The Sunday, the 27th, is the only Sunday until about the second Sunday in July, or so, maybe the third Sunday, that they have a Sunday off. Or rather, a Saturday off, I should say. That the Saturday, the 26th, they're going to be meeting every Saturday until about the second Saturday or so in July. That first Sunday, the 26th, Washington and a few of his friends decide that they're going to worship in a local church, and it's one of the local Catholic churches there in Philadelphia. Sundays, from that point on, would be a time for letter writing, some attending churches, that sort of thing. But this is what they're trying to accomplish. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. How do you do that? How do you put together that kind of a structure? And that's their challenge. One of the key personalities at the Constitutional Convention is James Madison. James Madison will be referred to as the father of the Constitution. Really the great compromise, although there are others from Virginia who are part of writing that. Madison's the primary force behind the great compromise. He's also the guy that we rely on to know exactly what happened. His notes on the Constitution are the primary resource that historians have looked to see who was saying what and why were they saying what they said, and so on. Madison reappears after the Constitution has been written, and during the fight for ratification. He's going to be one of the authors, the not so anonymous authors of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay are the primary authors of those papers, arguing that the Constitution really should be ratified. And there's a big debate about that. It's not certain at all. You see the non-complimentary photo, or not photo, but portrait of Benjamin Franklin. When you think about Franklin, you think about the elder statesman who's at the Constitutional Convention. There is a story that circulated about Franklin asking for prayer during the time of a deadlock in the Constitution. A lot of research has been done about that. Certainly Franklin calls for prayer, but it doesn't seem to go very far in the convention. So a lot that's been discussed about Franklin generally, in the role of faith that may have been present in Franklin's thinking, or role of faith not present in Franklin's thinking. One thing for certain, Franklin understood that what they were experiencing, what they were trying to do, was something that was beyond what any of them could accomplish on their own. And that sense that they needed this extra help. Now, when you think about the document that is produced, the Constitution, think about a system of checks and balances. Think about a limited national government. Think about not a democratic government, but think about representative democracy or a democratic republic. Think about, I've used the phrase, the descriptor, principled compromise. Without compromise, there is no Constitution. Without compromise today, government's paralyzed. And so the idea, or ideal, is to be able to develop a spirit of compromise, but a spirit of compromise which is based on principles, on private virtue, on commitment to a common good. There are four major compromises that are part of the convention. Any one of these issues addressed in these compromises could have killed the Constitution. It's hard to imagine that we would be where we are today without a Constitution. And so there was the sense among the delegates that they had to come up, those 39 who end up signing the Constitution, there's the sense they have to do the best they can to accomplish what they believe is essential, while at the same time recognizing they're not going to achieve all they want. They're going to have to put aside some sectional differences and some personal differences in order to produce a document which will in fact create a government that is strong enough and yet weak enough to ensure that we can go forward. Those four major compromises are the Great Compromise, the Electoral College Compromise, the 3/5 Compromise, and the Slave Trade Compromise. The Great Compromise is really this debate between big states and small states. And it's a debate between people who want a strong chief executive and those who want a weak chief executive. Those who want some sort of system that's more like the parliamentary system in the United Kingdom, in England. Those who want something different than that. The Virginia plan is, Edmund Randolph is portrayed there and identified as one of the chief architects of it. As I said earlier, James Madison is very much a part of the Virginia plan. Essentially, the Virginia plan is arguing that there ought to be a bicameral legislature, but that bicameral legislature, both houses, ought to include representation based on population. The counter to that from New Jersey in William Patterson is that no, there ought to be a unicameral legislature and it ought to be equal, every state having the same number of representatives. The Connecticut plan, which is that plan that brings the sides together, becomes then the Great Compromise and creates a bicameral legislature. The People's House, the House of Representatives, has representation based on population. Larger states having more power and influence than smaller states. But the Senate has equal representation among the states. And for those of you who remember ABC's government rock shows, I'm only a bill, I'm only a bill. No legislation, no bill becomes law unless it's approved in identical form in both houses of Congress. And as they're developing the responsibilities, the roles and responsibilities for each house, there are certain things that are reserved to one side or the other. All appropriation bills are going to begin in the House of Representatives. Any consideration of impeachment of a federal official, president or federal judge or whatever, the impeachment review is done in the House of Representatives, the People's House. The Senate, in an impeachment situation, is responsible for being a court and hearing the evidence. As in the case of the president, presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then coming to a conclusion. But there are the two houses that are established. And again, the idea is you and I are imperfect. You and I, as individuals who are east of Eden, appropriate for this weekend in Grand County and Fairmount, those of us who are east of Eden, we're flawed. And so it is essential that we have a government that keeps it, in which everyone is keeping an eye out on everyone else. Because otherwise, human temptation is to seek more and more power and to become increasingly influential and to denigrate the views, beliefs of others that disagree with us. The Electoral College. Again, think big state, small state. 1787, do you want a president? Do you want Virginia? Do you want New York? Do you want every president to come from Virginia or New York? At the end of the War of 1812, 1814, 1815, there was a convention in Hartford, Connecticut. One of the resolutions at the Hartford Convention is that no two successive presidents can come from the same state. They're concerned about undue influence that certain states, big states, may have over small states. The Electoral College is a system put into play to ensure that whoever is chosen president is someone who represents as many regions, as many groups that are part of the U.S. population as possible. That the president is as representative of the American people as possible. That's what they're thinking. There have been lots of ideas over the years to change the Electoral College. Some people just want to get rid of it. One plan that was that came forward a few years ago, 5 years ago, or 6, was a plan in which the Electoral College would still be in play, but it would all be math. Every state would have electoral votes equal to the number of members in the House of Representatives they have, plus the 2 senators. But there would be no actual electors. There would actually be nobody who met in the state capitals in December to cast the electoral vote. You simply mathematically calculate the vote. And the idea being that it still maintains the representative breadth as much as possible, while taking away that human factor in which you may have electors who show up and don't vote as their states have voted, and so on. One of the most misunderstood compromises in 2022 is this one. The 3/5 compromise was not by the delegates understood to be that someone who was a slave is only 3/5 of a person, only 3/5 of a human being. But here's the deal. You got guys, and notice who the main author of this is. It's James Wilson from Pennsylvania. James Wilson is from a state from which many abolitionists have come. State heavily influenced by Quaker beliefs, and the Quaker church, Quaker meetings, by and large, were some of the most articulate in their opposition to slavery. To think that James Wilson is proposing something that is in any way going to say that a slave is less than a full human being would be to misunderstand what he's trying to do. But here's the question. If you're in the North and you're an abolitionist, how should slaves be counted? Well, they should be counted as property, because that's how they were treated in the South. They were treated as property. And if you are an abolitionist in the North, if all of the slave population is to be counted for purposes of taxation, then you're going to be able to get rid of slavery because it's not going to be profitable. There's no way. Economically, this slavery can be sustained. Now, if you're a Southerner, you're going to have a counter. Absolutely not. Slaves should not be considered property. They should be considered as people, which is an ironic argument that they're making. So what they decide to do is this. The South is wanting to be able to come up with some kind of compromise which enables them to sustain the peculiar institution of slavery. But they see things are not going their way. So what can they do in the moment to do as much as they possibly can to sustain the institution of slavery? And yet come out, because these guys from Virginia, they want a constitution. They want a stronger central government. They do that. If you're in the North, if you're Wilson and his allies, what you want ultimately is to get rid of the system of slavery. You want it gone, abolished from this country. So they come up with this system, the 3/5 compromise, in which slaves are going to be counted 3/5 of the slave population, both for the purpose of taxation and for representation in Congress. It's imperfect. But the idea is, if you're a Northerner and an abolitionist, this is one way, at that moment in time, that you're going to be able to take another step forward toward your ultimate goal. And your ultimate goal is the abolition of slavery. If you're a Southerner, you can sign on to this because it gives you some time to try and work something out. It's imperfect. But the point, the thought, the main idea among the representatives at the Constitutional Convention was not to say the slaves are less than a person, simply a way, at that moment in time, for each side to promote its interests at that moment, but with something bigger in mind, tomorrow. This is something, there's no Constitution without this. The South walks. And the country was really struggling with being on the point of anarchy at this point. So what do? What should our expectations be with regard to moral issues that are brought into the political discussion? Should we expect that the political process will solve all of the debate? Or rather, should we expect that moral issues ought to be discussed? They ought to be part of a robust national conversation, but with the understanding that politics is not going to resolve the issue. Other groups, other institutions have responsibility for resolving those issues. The church, families, other community institutions have a responsibility to speak into this. The slave trade compromise is another major compromise. And again, it deals with the moral issue of slavery. It's a moral, political, economic issue, all together. You see the authors that are there. The northern states, particularly the New Englanders and folks from Pennsylvania, want to eliminate the slave trade now. Not tomorrow, not the day after, now. Again, that's not going to happen because the South is going to walk. So what do? Well, they talk, and in the debate, and in the conversations, in Independence Hall and in the pubs, they come to the conclusion that here's what we'll do. We're going to say that there's 20 years guaranteed for the continuation of the slave trade, the importation of slaves. At the end of 20 years, Congress will abolish it. And in fact, that's what Congress will do. Now, if you're a northerner, the way you look at this is there's no way that slavery as an institution can be sustained without the importation of slaves. It's dead. If you're a southerner, you say, well, we've got 20 years. We've got 20 years to get more states into the Union. We've got 20 years to shore up what we're doing. We have 20 years to do what we have to do to ensure that the institution continues. In 1808, slave trade is going to be abolished. What the guys from New England, what the guys from Pennsylvania did not anticipate was that the South would focus very heavily on the production of more slaves domestically, which is one of the most horrific parts of slavery as an institution in those years after 1808. We come to the end of the Constitutional Convention, and the ratification is pretty iffy. And so one of the ways of persuading the states to ratify the Constitution is to propose what Virginia already has in place. The Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution is patterned heavily on the Virginia Bill of Rights. First Amendment being the most significant, the freedom of conscience, speech, press, assembly, the right to petition, these kinds of basic rights that are essential if you're going to have a country in which people are electing representatives and people are engaged in decision making, in discussion about major issues. The Second Amendment, we all know, hotly debated, the right to bear arms. And again, if you are these guys in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and you're reflecting on Lexington and Concord, and you're reflecting on your experience with Britain in those years leading up to the American Revolution, the right to bear arms and the militia, this is very important. Those 10 amendments are going to be part of major debate and discussion. And that major debate and discussion is going to take the form of lots of pamphlets and lots of meetings, small groups and large groups. But one of the major series of letters appearing in newspapers around the states is the Federalist Papers, written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. One of the most significant of those is Federalist 51, written by James Madison. And again, it goes to the core of what these guys were thinking. You and I, we're not angels. And just because we are elected to an office or just because we're part of a group doesn't mean that we ought to be able to do whatever it is that we want to do. There has to be checks and balances. And so they deliberately create a system of government which makes it hard for the national government, for the central government, to do anything. Particularly anything that would take away the freedom. Amendment 10, powers reserved for the states, would make it very difficult for the federal government to take away liberty that states have to make decisions. That's very much what they're thinking. The Federalist Papers circulate. But while the Federalist Papers are circulating, there's another group, the Anti-Federalists, who are also writing letters in newspapers. Tim and I can remember a time when there were two newspapers in Marion, a morning newspaper and an afternoon newspaper. And when there was a a healthy circulation of readers for those papers. And they actually had a whole staff of reporters. This is a time when lots of people are looking at newspapers to get their news and debating and discussing that. Guys like Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams. Guys like George Mason in Virginia. These individuals are influential, and they're arguing, you don't want the Constitution, because the Constitution is going to ultimately take major power away from the states. We're going to lose liberty at the state level in this new system of government. Well, the ratification vote begins. The states in their conventions and state legislatures begin considering the Constitution. The first state to ratify is Delaware, and that occurs in December. The last state to ratify is Rhode Island. Lincoln is kind of a puzzle with regard to what these guys did in 1787. If you look at the Civil War, Lincoln clearly is not so focused on the Constitution as he is on the Declaration of Independence. For Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence is who we are. At the very core, it represents what this country is. The Constitution is a system. It provides a structure within which the vision of the Declaration can be enacted. During the Civil War, Lincoln very consciously is going to, in the case of Missouri, suspend civilian government, replace it with military government. Here in Indiana, a little more than a stone's throw from Marion and Huntington, you have a private citizen sympathetic to the Confederacy. He's going to be tried not by a jury of his peers, he's going to be tried by a military court. Milligan case. And Lincoln also is going to suspend writs of habeas corpus. And their Congressman Landingham from Ohio is going to discover the First Amendment right to freely express yourself, maybe it doesn't relate during time of war. So he's going to be kicked out to the Confederacy, work his way back to Canada, back into Ohio. Lincoln very consciously is doing what he feels is necessary, even though it contradicts what these guys did in the summer of 1787. Because the Union has to be saved. Even so, Lincoln understands that the Constitution still provides protections. He's doing these things which are unconstitutional, some of which the Supreme Court is going to rule as unconstitutional following the war. Lincoln says, look, if you don't like what I'm doing, if you feel this is too far, the House of Representatives has the power to impeach. The Senate has the right to try and convict and remove the president from office. There's an election in 1864. You don't have to vote for Lincoln. You can vote for McClellan in 1864. So Lincoln's emphasis is on the Constitution, on the Declaration, the vision in the Declaration. And yet even so, again, if you're in the back, you're getting the end of reading, probably this. But Lincoln has high regard for the Constitution that he's violating consciously. Don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it's the only safeguard of our liberties. And in 1858, when Lincoln, in 1858, Lincoln says, the prosperity of the United States is not the result of accident. It has a philosophic cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. 1861, in March, he takes the oath of office as president. His commitment to the Constitution will be sorely tried at that point, but it doesn't waver. And I close with this quote from Barbara Jordan, who during 1974, in the midst of House Judiciary Committee's investigation involving Richard Nixon's conduct, speaking as a very articulate African-American member of Congress, Barbara Jordan says, "We the people." It's a very eloquent beginning, but when the Constitution was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that "we the people." I thought somehow for many years that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I've finally been included in "we the people." My faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete. It is total. I thought that there's an eloquent statement from a highly revered member of Congress.